Recasting is a thing which sometimes has to take place in the world of film, and this has been evident in the likes of Mark Ruffalo taking Edward Norton's place as the Hulk in the MCU, Michael Gambon picking up the role of Dumbledore in Harry Potter, or James Bond changing his face every 10 years or so. Obviously then, it should come as little surprise that wrestling is the same in this respect, as on multiple occasions, gimmicks have had to be portrayed by two or more people. But what are the biggest examples of this in wrestling history? Well, that's exactly what we're going to be looking at today. And where better to start off with than one of the most infamous recasting of all, and that's the one which involved both Diesel and Razor Ramon. Yes, this is a moment people remember today for all the wrong reasons, as it was pretty god-awful if we're being honest. What made it so bad? Well, because the two men brought in to replace Kevin Nash and Scott Hall after they left WWF just couldn't match up to what came before them. But how could they ever realistically be expected to, as Big Sexy so perfectly embodied the laid-back cool required for a character like the former WWF champion Diesel? Hell, he didn't even have to be a good wrestler to get over in this role. All he had to do was perform a jackknife powerbomb from time to time, and fans were happy. And when it came to Scott Hall and his portrayal of Razor Ramon, well, that was even more difficult for anyone to live up to, as he was so dripping with swagger and charisma every time he walked out to the ring adorned in gold chains and chewing on a toothpick, there was simply no one else who could get on his level. So when both decided that they were tired of wallowing away in the deadlands that was mid-90s WWF, and they instead took Eric Bischoff's big money offer to join WCW, Vince McMahon was left with a conundrum. Sure, he could have just dropped the characters entirely at this point, but given he owned the IP, he chose to simply recast them instead. And that's what led to the situation which took place in September of 1996, when Jim Ross came out to the ring and announced he brought back Diesel and Razor. Unfortunately though, when they came out through the curtain this time, it was no longer Nash and Hall. No, instead it was Glenn Jacobs and Rick Bogner. Needless to say then, this one didn't get over with fans, and it wasn't long before the entire thing was dropped, with Bogner at this point briefly moving on to places like AAA, New Japan, and the USWA before retiring altogether, and Jacobs being reborn as an all-new character in 1997. Who was this character? Well, he's our next subject as it happens. None other than the Big Red Machine, Kane. That's right, Glenn Jacobs has played two characters portrayed by multiple people over the course of his career, but while his time as Diesel is definitely seen as the lesser of the versions of that gimmick, his time as Kane is absolutely the superior one. After all, it's him who first brought it to life in October of 1997, after months of his kayfabe father Paul Bearer teasing his introduction. And it's Jacobs who made Kane such a mainstay of New York over the next 2.5 decades, as during this time, he did just about everything a WWE superstar could do, whether this be win world titles, main event pay-per-views, or dominate Royal Rumble matches. That said, he's not the only person to play the character over the years, because at one point, on an episode of Raw on July 6, 1998, his kayfabe brother The Undertaker disguised himself as the Big Red Machine in order to win a #1 contendership bout for Stone Cold Steve Austin's WWF title. Then, as if that weren't enough, in the summer of 2006, another imposter version of Kane began appearing on TV in order to challenge the original, with this one being portrayed by future Bullet Club member Doc Gallows. Of course, you wouldn't have known it was him by watching Raw though, as this whole angle was dropped pretty quickly after it began. Hell, Gallows' face was never even seen on TV while he was in the red and black bodysuit. But then maybe that's for the best, because it was always Glenn Jacobs who was the best fit for the part, and it's for that reason it should always be him who's remembered as the real and most definitive Kane. And the same could be said when talking about Mark Calloway's portrayal of his kayfabe sibling, The Undertaker, as it happens, though that doesn't mean someone else didn't put forward a good attempt at trying to usurp him at one point. Who was this figure who tried to out-Deadman the Deadman? Well, that would be Brian Lee, the man better known to Attitude Era fans as Chains, 1/4 of the Disciples of Apocalypse, and the reason he was put in such a role in the first place was because in real life, he's a close friend of Calloway. Sure, it also helped that with his long hair and big build, he looked somewhat similar to the Phenom at a glance, so when Vince McMahon came up with the Undertaker vs. Undertaker angle for SummerSlam 1994, he was the obvious choice to play the imposter version. Before he did that though, he'd have to be given a reason to be brought in at all, with this reason coming when the original Deadman disappeared from TV after apparently ascending to heaven following a casket match against Yokozuna at that January's Royal Rumble. And with him gone for the foreseeable future then, Ted DiBiase saw an opportunity to capitalize by claiming he'd revived the former WWF champion and was bringing him back to the ring. Of course he wasn't though. No, the version of The Undertaker he had was nothing more than a pretender, So when Paul Bearer got wind of this, he brought the original back to challenge Bryan Lee at the biggest show of the summer in order to see which one would come out on top. Sadly, however, the match which followed wouldn't be up to much. In fact, it would end up being one of the worst bouts of the era. And once it was over, the idea of an impostor Undertaker running wild over WWF was dropped entirely, as once he fell to Mark Calloway that night, he disappeared forever. Well, at least until a group of bikers signed up with the company in 1997, that was. But it wasn't just WWF who were running imposter angles at this point, as over in the other major North American promotion at the time, World Championship Wrestling, their top babyface Sting was also struggling to prove his identity, as he had his own pretender to contend with. What was the story behind this one? Well, after the formation of the NWO in the summer of 1996, everyone in WCW was forced to choose a side. Would they remain loyal to the company which had employed them up until then, or would they choose to switch lanes and join the cool new heel group? And of the people who were being courted at this point, perhaps none were in higher demand than Sting, because with him being the beating heart of the Southern wrestling promotion, whichever side he chose to align himself was likely going to be the overall winner. So that's why it was so frustrating for both WCW and the NWO then, when at least initially, Steve Borden chose to go solo and not be an official part of either side going forward. Why had he made such a decision? Well, after the NWO brought in a fake Sting to make it look like he'd joined forces with the heels, the Californian felt slighted by the fact that so many of his WCW peers had so easily believed he'd abandoned them. Yes, in one fell swoop, Jeff Farmer, the man behind the imposter version of the character, had caused so much dissent among the babyface locker room that he has to be considered one of the more successful alternative versions of a gimmick in history. And this level of notoriety meant that even when it was uncovered that he wasn't, in fact, the real Sting, he continued going under the moniker of NWO Sting for a few years yet, with him finding success with this both in the West and in the East. That said, it'll always be the original who will most closely be associated with the character, as even after WCW died in 2001, Steve Borden continued to portray it in the likes of TNA, WWE, and AEW. And it's in this latter company where he currently shares a locker room with our next two subjects, Adam Copeland and Christian Cage. But why are they our next two subjects? Well, because back at the turn of the millennium, when they were riding high in WWF's tag team division as Edge and Christian, they became the second of many to play Los Conquistadors. That's right, it's time to take things in a much more lighthearted, comedic direction for a while, as this was a situation very much designed to bring the laughs. But then, why wouldn't it be? Because few duos were better suited at playing the role of goofy heels in 2000 than Edge and Christian. And that was what made their decision to disguise themselves as the late 80s team made up of Jose Luis Rivera and Jose Estrada at this point so perfect then, as it afforded them a prime opportunity to not only make fans giggle, but also earn a shot at the Hardy Boys tag team titles. But wait, why did they have to do this at all? Well, because the Canadians had been banned from challenging for the belts again while they were being held by Matt and Jeff, as they'd already lost to them a few weeks prior. That said, two people who weren't banned from going after the gold were Los Conquistadors, and luckily, with their ring gear being made up of gold bodysuits and face coverings, it was easy for someone else to step into their shoes unbeknownst to anyone else. How did such a deception work out for Edge and Christian? Pretty well as it happened, because after earning their title shot, they'd go on to beat the Hardys at October 2000's No Mercy. But that wouldn't be the end of the Los Conquistadors saga, because as a means of revenge, Matt and Jeff would also don the gold ring gear themselves the next night on Raw in order to get their championships back. And even after that was done, further duos would revive the gimmick in the years which followed, as in 2003, Rob Conway and Nick Dinsmore also played the team, though in this particular case, their ring gear would be made up of both gold and blue. Then, 10 days later at Vengeance, Conway revived Los Conquistadors once again during the APA Invitational Barroom Brawl, with his partner in crime this time being Johnny Jeter. But even that wasn't the last time a Conquistador was seen in a WWE ring, as a full decade and a half later in 2018, Kurt Angle donned the original gold bodysuit in order to win a Battle Royal and earn himself a spot in the WWE World Cup. Does this mean we can expect to see at least one member of Los Conquistadors return again at some point in the future? Probably. And they're not the only classic gimmick which keeps coming back, as even today, every so often, a new version of Doink the Clown will appear on screen. Sure, the character might never have been done better than it was with the original incarnation played by Matt Osborne back in the early 90s, but that doesn't mean other people haven't put forward a good attempt over the years. After all, following the end of the more evil psycho version of Doink, which Osborne portrayed between 1992 and 1993, there was plenty of opportunity for others to pick up the mantle, and of those who tried to do this, the first would be Steve Keirn, the former Skinner. With that said, what makes this version unique when stood up next to others is that it actually happened before the first Doink was fired. Yes, this one happened at WrestleMania 9 during a match between Doink and Crush. You all know the one we're talking about, the one where a second clown came out from under the ring and did the now famous mirror spot with the original. But Keirn was far from the only other person to play the character in the years which followed, as once Matt Osborne and WWF parted ways, it would be Steve Lombardi who took up the face paint full time. With this being the point, things went in a far more family-friendly babyface direction, and since that run has ended, the likes of Men on a Mission, the Bushwhackers, Nick Dinsmore, Jeff Jarrett, and even Chris Jericho have all briefly played the role too, with a number of others also doing the same out on the indie circuit. In fact, if you've ever gone to see your local wrestling promotion live, then there's a good chance you've also witnessed someone doing the Doink gimmick there, as it seems to be one which WWE have turned a blind eye to people using on the side. Hell, at this point, it's become so commonplace in other small companies that it's basically public domain. So don't be surprised if Doink shows up at a venue near you sometime soon. One character which won't be showing up again anytime in the near future, though, is another one from Vince McMahon's New Generation era, and the reason it's likely been shelved for good is because despite two people technically playing it over the years, Max Moon was never able to make much of an impact. But then maybe the reason for that is because even by the standards of the mid-90s, it was pretty silly. After all, this was WWF expecting us to buy into the fact that a Moon Man had come to America in search of a job as a professional wrestler. Or maybe he wasn't supposed to be an alien at all? Maybe he was supposed to be an astronaut of some kind? To be honest, we were never fully clear on what was going on there. Well, what we can be sure of, however, is that at least initially, the whole thing had been designed with Lucha Libre legend Conan in mind. That's right, after bringing the AAA and CMLL star into the fold in the early 90s, Vince McMahon sold him on the idea of a gimmick which would see him wear an aggressively loud blue and pink moon suit. Unfortunately for the boss, though, once Conan got an idea of how ridiculous this was going to make him come across, he bailed on the whole thing and instead returned back down to Mexico, where he'd continue to be treated like a god. And this created a problem then, as after having spent so much money on designing the character, WWF didn't want to just throw it away. So that was why they decided to simply recast it at this point, as they hired journeyman performer Paul Diamond to take up the mantle for TV. How would Diamond fare in this new role? Well, he was no Conan, we can say that for sure. But this didn't mean he was terrible. No, he did about as good a job as could have been expected under the circumstances, with him spending the next 4 months taking on the likes of Terry Taylor, the Repo Man, and the model Rick Martel, all before getting a lone shot at the Intercontinental title then being held by Shawn Michaels in January of 1993. In the end, though, Paul Diamond wouldn't be able to win gold here. No, instead this would mark the high point of his run, as just 1 month later both he and the gimmick he was playing would be axed altogether. Still, it could have been worse, because for as much as this one fizzled out, it was never as much of a mess as the situation was when Sin Cara joined WWE in 2011. Yeah, it's time for us to talk about perhaps the most confusing character lineage in WWE history. Why is it so confusing? Well, because both men who played him also played the same character prior to that in Mexico. Seriously, before he became the original Sin Cara in 2011, Luis Alverde was already riding high in his home country as the lucha sensation Místico. Hell, in CMLL alone, he'd win just about every title they had there. Unfortunately though, because WWE uses a very specific style which everyone has to alter themselves to accommodate for, once Místico joined the US company and took on his new gimmick, he quickly found himself struggling to get over, as he just wasn't able to do what made him so special before that anymore. And so that was why later that same year, a new version of Sin Cara was brought in to replace Alverde, with this one being played by Jose Rodriguez, the very man who had taken up the mantle of Místico in Mexico after Alverde. And because the character was under a mask anyway, it meant that it was hard for fans to notice any of these changes at first. That said, the original man behind the gimmick certainly noticed, which was exactly why he returned to confront his pretender in September of that year. How would the subsequent feud between the pair go? Not too great if we're being honest, because by then, most fans had tuned out of the whole thing. Still, even if interest was low, once it was over, the OG Sin Cara was able to regain both his mask and his position as the holder of the gimmick, with Rodriguez instead being rebranded as Unico at this point. But that wouldn't be the end of the confusion, because once Luis Alverde chose to leave WWE in 2014 in order to return to Mexico, Vince McMahon decided to keep the Sin Cara character alive by just putting Jose Rodriguez under the mask once again and acting like he'd always been there. Does your head hurt yet? It should, because honestly, we struggled to keep up with this one at point. So let's move away from the confusing tale of Sin Cara for now, and instead focus on TNA for a while, as it was there a more simplified story of a character being portrayed by multiple performers played itself out. Who are we talking about this time? Who else but Suicide? Now, we will say there's one confusing aspect to the Suicide gimmick which is unique to it, and this is that it began life as a video game character. That's right, before he ever hit the six-sided ring, the masked mystery figure was first introduced in 2008's TNA Impact for PlayStation, Xbox, and Wii, where the voice and motion capture was provided by Low Key. And as a means of trying to promote the game then, not long after it was released, TNA began hyping up the debut of Suicide as a real-life in-ring performer too, with the mystery at this point being, who exactly was he? Would it be a case where Low Key simply donned the mask in reality? Or would it be a situation where someone else took up the mantle instead? The answer to that was a little complicated. Why was it complicated? Well, because rather than just be played by one person across his initial run between 2008 and 2011, Suicide would actually be portrayed by 3 separate wrestlers at various points, with these wrestlers being Christopher Daniels, Frankie Kazarian, and Akira Rajin. And as if that wasn't enough, after the gimmick was shelved briefly and then brought back again in 2013, there would be 4 more people who took up the mantle, namely TJ Perkins, Jonathan Gresham, Caleb Conley, and Nash Carter. Hell, as it stands right now, there are more people who have been Suicide than who have won the AEW World title, giving you an idea of just how much turnover there's been when it comes to this video game character brought to life. And that's not even taking into account the fact that both Austin Aries and Crazy Steve have each disguised themselves as the character over the years as well. So with this in mind, the only question we have left is, who will be the next to take up the mantle? Hell, given how much every company outside of WWE seems to have an open door policy with one another these days, there's every possibility we could see someone from outside the Impact Zone don the mask yet. Maybe even a Kenny Omega or an MJF. One person who definitely won't be playing the role, however, is Barry Darsow, as his time as an active wrestler ended a long time ago. But while fans probably know him best today as one half and then later 1/3 of Demolition, what some might not be aware is that he was not the only person to play the role of Smash. No, before he was ever pegged for the spot, there was another who wore the dominatrix gear alongside Bill Eadie's axe, and that was Randy Colley. Who was Randy Colley? Well, he was more commonly known as Moondog Rex, one half of the ever-present territory tag team, the Moondogs. Come the late 80s though, with Vince McMahon feeling that duo had run its course, the boss decided to repackage Colley by having him be part of the new team he'd created specifically to compete with the NWA's Road Warriors. The only problem with this, however, was that even if he did shave his beard and wear face paint for the role, fans immediately recognized the former Moondog Rex for who he was, causing them to chant his old name whenever he came through the curtain. And so that was why, realizing the whole thing wasn't going to work then, Vince decided to replace the Alabama native with Barry Darsow instead soon thereafter, with it being him who would portray Smash for the rest of the team's run. What happened to Moondog Rex following that? Well, he'd continue to work in the likes of WCW, USWA, and Smoky Mountain Wrestling for a few years yet, before retiring altogether in 1997. And as for Barry Darsow, once his time in Demolition was over, he'd get another successful gimmick when he began portraying the Repo Man.